talked about a little bit about the Mars Titan War. We've mostly kind of swam and the repercussions of the Mars Titan War and talked a lot about Titan Civil War. But there's an upcoming,
There's a bigger conflict. Yeah.
there's a bigger conflict ahead. Those are just sort of the preambles to the big
Yep.
conflict. And that conflict is the frontier wars, right? Which you referred to me several times. And what you have referred to me to as the main story, right? And so all of this
Mhm.
we've been doing so far has been sort of preamble, right? Not that this is the last story, but this is more the first story that you began writing 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And the frontier wars will be explored in something called Spacers the Titan Gambit.
Yep.
Now, talk to me about the frontier wars. I want to know who the sides are, who the aggressor is, what's going on.
Yep. Well, the frontier wars are, I think, the closest thing I would analogize them to, if we're leaning heavily on our social commentary, morality play type thing that all good sci-fi does. The closest thing I could analogize the frontier to would be the World Wars. You basically got two massive alliances, in one case literally called the Alliance, that are arrayed against each other for control of resources and territory across the mid and outer solar system. And one side is the Interplanetary Cooperative Administration, the ICA, which is, of course, the sort of analog of NATO or the European Union that we've discussed before, that is a conglomerate of all of the different, or at least used to be a conglomerate of all the different space organisms, or most of the different space governments in all of settled space within solar space.
The ICA, if I remember correctly, is kind of our anagram for the NATO Western led order of our current society, sort of the neoliberal capitalism brought into space and
Mm-hmm.
and the status quo.
Yep.
And the Alliance fights
On
against the
three
status quo.
worlds.
The Alliance of
Yep.
Free Worlds. Who are they? What planets are the free worlds?
Well, if the ICA is analogous to the sort of Western NATO type alliance, then the Alliance of Free Worlds is analogous to the Warsaw Pact. They
Okay.
are, I don't want to see, the thing about qualifying them as far as like politics and economics and stuff is kind of difficult, because it's not, because economics and politics will evolve over the next 300 years, but they're analogous ways to the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union and organizations like that, and the Shanghai Pact nowadays that we're using kind of as the equivalent to the Warsaw Pact in the second Cold War of Petrichor, which is another story we're working on. But the alliance is centered primarily around three big worlds. They call them the big three. That's Callisto, Titan, and Ganymede. Callisto and Ganymede are moons of Jupiter. Titan is a moon of Saturn. There are a number of smaller moons and other moons, and there's even part of the asteroid belt that they own. But basically, mid solar system out, they're, if not the major player, then they're one of the major players, because ever since they emerged in about 23, 40 or 41, I want to say, based if I'm remembering my own lore correctly, they have just sort of taken over. It's kind of, again, at the risk of diving into troublesome Earth history, it's kind of analogous to the way communism spread through Eastern Europe and Asia in the first half and maybe a little bit into the second half of the 20th century, because you've got this massive organization, the Alliance of Free Worlds, that basically is I don't want to say preying upon per se, but they're definitely seizing upon the opportunity opened up by all this disgruntledness and disenfranchisement of the frontier citizens caused by the Draconist Wars, where the Draconists are basically like, you know, a radical insurgent, a radical insurrectionist insurgent faction.
You've got planets, 3 planets that have seen nothing but conflict and war and death for the better part of a century. And then those 3 planets, maybe 50 years, maybe century, a little bit in between,
Yeah,
and
several decades anyway.
several decades anyway. And so, with all of that pain and hardship and everything brought on by the rise of the Draconist, and after now the Draconists are defeated at this point.
By the time the alliance comes about, the Draconists are on their back foot, but they're not quite defeated yet.
So the
That's
Alliance
actually
aren't Draconist.
no, the alliance are not Draconists. There are some alliance leadership. Some of the alliance leadership are former Draconists. See, it's a very I know you're very much of the mind to simplify. You know, Thoreau says simplify, simplify. I'm of the mind to complicate because real life is complicated, which means obviously it will meet somewhere in the middle. But the thing about the relationship between the Alliance and the Draconis front or the Drac or whatever you want to call them is that it's kind of interwoven for a while
Mhm.
because if anything, the Alliance needs the Draconists. It's kind of a good cop, bad cop routine. The Alliance is like, hey, you see these nutcases over here? We're offering civilization. They're offering beheadings and bombings and stuff. If you don't go,
Right.
if you don't take our carrot, we're going to let them hit you with the stick. So it's
Right.
kind of a symbiotic relationship. The Alliance needs the Draconists to offer a scary alternative to their vision of civilization, and the Draconists need the Alliance to keep funneling money and arms to them so they can fight the ICA, which in turn also supports the Alliance's goal of undermining the ICA in the frontier because they want to be the top dog in the outer solar system. So
Okay.
it's kind of like how again, you talk about all these proxy wars that happened in the and during the Cold War. A lot of the stuff that happens, especially in the second half of the Draconis Wars, is basically proxy conflicts. It's basically the Alliance funneling money and arms to Draconis operatives to fight the ICA and its forces for them. And there's a lot of animosity between the ICA and the Alliance, even before they ever go to war, like for a couple decades. There's like when they would hold summits and peace conferences, the ICA, peace delegates would always be sort of side eyeing the Alliance ones, like, weren't you like at that meeting I saw you at that meeting with Draconis just last week, selling them nukes to use on some space station somewhere or something like that. It's a very fraught political situation.
So this fraught political situation comes to a head with
Mm-hmm.
the elements of the sort of neoliberal capitalist status quo of the ICA going against the more Marxist socialist of the Alliance of Free Worlds. What's the catalyzing event?
Well, there's a couple actually, and I'll run through them because they kind of happen in quick succession. The main one is that there's what they call the Mars crisis, what I call the Mars crisis, I suppose what we call the Mars crisis, being that we are toll writers, is that in I want to say this, it would be this our summer. I don't know what season it would be on Mars, but it's our summer of 2369, which is the Martian bicentennial, or not the Martian bicentennial, but the bicentennial of the founding of the United Nations of Mars. The United Nations of Mars is kind of analogous to the United States in the Spacers Saga. They make up roughly 4% of the population of off-world settled of the off-world population, and they are sort of a military and industrial power that sort of leverages their military and industrial power to give themselves a pretty good standard of living, even though it's not always perfect. But what you're going to do. But during the Mars crisis, what happened is this is actually a story that I wrote and released before we even met, I think. There's that story called Bicentennial, where there's this young like Spacer Corps soldier or Spacer Corps spacer, basically, who accidentally kills some civil organizer at a protest, like a workers' protest on Mars, and that sparks a bunch of riots and demonstrations and just general unrest. And because of that, that spills over and sort of catalyzes a bunch of unrest and riots in places elsewhere, because it's kind of like you look at what happens when people when the people rise up here in the United States. It happens in a lot of other places too, because we have an influential culture.
Is it like the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, where that one assassination kind of
It's analogous, not a straight analogy, because the guy who was killed wasn't like an archduke,
yeah,
but it's kind of like it was kind of like if the killing of Archduke Ferdinand was one of these police killings that happened back in the summer of 2020. It's kind of like if you
right.
mix those two things, because it's basically the straw that broke the camel's back, because it's basically the reason why it was so inflammatory is that the people of Mars, even which is nominally a very pro ICA world, sort of for this one burning moment in the summer of 2369, saw the Spacer Corps as an oppressive force, and because the ability of the Spacer Corps to effectively establish peace and law and order in solar space was called into question, that raised a bunch of other problems elsewhere, because you got other places that are like, wait a second, we can't trust the people that we've been hoping will keep back the Draconis hordes for the last 30 years or 40 years or whatever. We can't trust them to keep us safe. They're basically just they're just another form of a corporate boot on our necks.
They lost
And
confidence.
but yeah, it was a loss of confidence in the peacekeeping and security force of the ICA. And what happened next is sort of the two punch of the 1-2 punch, because what happened next is that this special forces unit, one of the alpha groups, that's the alphas that we've talked about, I think in episodes, which are like special commando units that the ICA trained from childhood to be like basically have psionic powers. They're kind of like if you took the Psi Corps from Babylon 5 and mixed them with the Spartan program from Halo.
Okay.
And you basically they deployed them throughout the outer solar system, beginning in around 2369, especially around the time of the Mars crisis, to sort of keep an eye on things. Because you have to understand, I know this is stepping back a step, but you have to understand the Project Alpha was founded, conceptualized, funded, run, all of that for the express purpose of preventing the next Draconis crisis. It's kind of like how the United States government during the Cold War had so many little schemes to sort of end the Cold War or prevent the next Cold War. It's like how the United States government nowadays has so many little schemes to prevent or preempt terrorist attacks like 9/11 or the uprising of dangerous countries that could get nukes. It's things like that. The problem is, maybe a year or two within a year or two after the Mars of the start of the Mars crisis, one of these teams is captured by the Alliance, like in their capital, basically. And that incident catalyzes a spiral of diplomatic, basically a diplomatic shitstorm that eventually leads to regular military forces being deployed to their mutual borders, which then in turn kind of leads to that situation that if you've ever seen Hunt for Red October, you know exactly what I'm talking about, where Jeffrey Pelt's character, the national security advisor, says it is inherently dangerous to have your ships and our ships, your air forces and our air forces in such close proximity, Mr. Ambassador. Wars have begun that way. That's basically what happens. They as the diplomats and ambassadors are pointing fingers at each other over this secret commando team being captured in the heart of Alliance territory, the two sides militaries are deploying right up to the line of departure, basically, and then all it takes is someone to blink. And then when someone blinks, it's kind of like the first arrow to
So
fly comes deep.
so the catalyzing incident. No, I mean things will happen in a vacuum, and there's no one thing, but
Mhm.
the last thing, the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were, was there were special force there were special forces units that had telepathic abilities that got caught inside Alliance of Free World capital areas. And then because if you have like a spec op guy and he can read your thoughts, he's going to be unstoppable. Like there's nothing you can do against him. Just give up. And they caught that guy in the capital. And so
Mhm.
that's like the most dangerous possible spy. And so that's
Yeah,
the thing that sparks the conflict.
pretty much. Because it's basically, again, because that's the thing. It's the idea that information is the greatest weapon, and again, and they're using this greatest weapon against us. Because the whole point of the alphas is they're an evolution of an old trend, which is that we want to have spies that can blend in perfectly with the enemy.
Sure.
Because if you have spies that can like read the thoughts of the people they're supposed to like integrate with, so they can then observe them and gain intelligence, they can not only gain intelligence more easily, they can blend in more easily. Because you let's say you're assigned a cover identity and you're going to live in this hotel with the, or you're going to live in this apartment with other people. Well, you can like read their, you can pierce their thoughts and know stuff about them that they wouldn't, that you wouldn't normally know, so you can blend in more easily. So
Sure.
it's a very, that in and of itself is a very inflammatory thing. And of course, the fact that it's been conducted in secret, it's kind of like um, it's like the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States wasn't just mad that the Soviets were supposedly putting nukes in Cuba. It's that they were doing it secretly. It's always that it seems nonsensical looking back, but at the time, the fact that they're doing this right under our nose, it had such a je ne sais quoi to it, that there's like well, of course they're doing it. We're doing the same thing. We're doing it in Turkey. That's
Yeah.
basically, for anyone who doesn't know their history, that's how the Cuban Missile Crisis was diffused. JFK agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey. So we were doing the same thing. So, it's not like either side necessarily had their hands clean, but the United States is basically saying, well, you're putting missiles 90 miles off our coast and you're doing it, and then saying, no, we're not. So
Sure.
basically, when the ICA is sending secret mind reading commandos into the heart of alliance territory to like spy on their leadership and government and military and all of that, and then saying, no, we didn't, that's galling. That's a
Yeah.
slap in the face. And any superpower or would be superpower or whatever is not going to sit still and get slapped in the face without slapping back. And that's basically where you get the start of the frontier wars. And then from there, it's basically, like I said, it's kind of analogous to a more traditional war. And when I say traditional war, I mean more traditional than the Draconist Wars, because as we discussed Draconist Wars episode, the Draconist Wars are kind of more analogous to almost like a gangland war
I mean,
than
it's the
they are.
global war on terror.
It's kind of global war on terror. You have less like fights of the kind that the military supposedly trains for, or at least used to train for back during like the Cold War, and more fights where it's like, oh, we're going to go into this place and do like presence patrols, or we're going to go into this place and send like basically do presence patrols. So the special forces are kind of kicking down doors and like arresting people, and the people that they're arresting are like trying to sneak up and shoot us in the back of the head or plant bombs in cars, and stuff like that.
I remember because the first half of my career in the military
Mhm.
was um, any sort of combat training I had was counterinsurgency.
Mhm.
Probably the second half of my career was more combined arms
Yep.
sort of stuff. And I remember the switch, and I remember how different it was, you know. And I mean, people knew combined arms stuff before the switch, but I remember specifically when the overall general, like emphasis was. We're going to switch back to more of a combined arms, training for all of our stuff. And so the second half of my career was more focused on combined arms training. But also, I mean, the second half of my career was spent in the infantry. So that might be why, there's more of an emphasis on combined arms. I don't know. It's hard to
Mhm.
it's hard to take your own specific experience and then try to extrapolate that and zoom out at 30,000 feet.
Yeah.
Because yes, that could inform you of what 30,000 feet looks like, but also it probably doesn't, or at least there's probably a lot you don't know.
It's like trying to
But
zoom out a video game that, to if like you when you zoom out of a video game map to 30,000 feet, the entire world is probably not going to render.
probably not, no. Um, the Frontier Wars begin when the ICA is caught sending their telepathic special operations. It's like if they sent James Bond, but he could also read your mind.
Yeah.
And if they sent James Bond to like Moscow, but James Bond also has telepathy.
Mhm.
And then that sparks a conflict because the main players, from what I understand, are Earth and Mars against Ganymede, Titan, and Callisto.
Yep. Well, Mars and Ceres. Earth is kind of doing its own thing at this point, which is a whole other story. Earth kind of doesn't really involve itself in the affairs of all world aside from maybe like doing trade with them. They're kind of neutral. They're kind of like Finland during the Cold War.
See, that doesn't make sense to me.
Well, the reason is because Earth basically the people who founded all of these settlements escaped from Earth.
Hmm.
And I know this is kind of going down a rabbit hole. The reason kind of a backwater or is considered a backwater in the future of the Spacers Saga is that Earth kind of elected to be a backwater because they realized that all of the in like heavy industry and fast-paced politics and when tricky shady dealings that was going on in the say 19th 20th 21st centuries almost destroyed the biosphere. So it's kind of like the people who remain decide, well, we're just going to kind of, have our nice farms and our nice like eco cities and just kind of, this is kind of, play it safe.
Yes, but if all this stuff comes from Earth, then I feel like Earth would be the central, like all of it would originate from Earth. Like Earth is that's where all the humans come from.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, yes, everyone's not everyone's born on Earth, but you
Well, it's
know,
actually funny you mentioned that because one thing I've thought of many times is this notion that what if one of the major things, not major necessarily, but one of the things Earth was known for by like the 24th century or whatever, is being a place for people to go and raise their kids. Because one of the things that we don't know as of now in the real world of 2024 when it comes to space and like space exploration science is can you have kids in space? Because the one thing we've always had when people had gestated offspring and then gave birth to babies is one Earth gravity from Earth's gravity well. We don't know if we can do it on the moon or on Mars or in zero G, God forbid, or even on a space station with artificial gravity from like spinning or something. So we don't know if we'll have to basically have people who get pregnant ship back to Earth to have their babies, raise them for a few months maybe so they can have the ability to live on places like Earth. Because that's another thing. If you raise a child, even if you can have children on Mars, for having a child on Mars basically damns that child to never being able to go back to Earth because their body rears itself in an environment where it is not used to the one gravity pull of Earth. So if this person is raised in 38% gravity, they go back to Earth and they're like, oh, I can't take it. Get me off this damn planet. So that's kind of a question that remains unanswered.
I would go with, I mean, yeah, like it would make sense to, if you're raised on Mars and you're used to 38% of Earth's gravity, you're probably not going to Earth. But also, you don't see Earth as home. But in my head, like, look at the United States. The United States, by the standards of much of the world, is a utopia because there's so much
Mhm.
food here and it's so easy to get. And it's not that hard to get.
Yep.
And especially throughout much of human history, the United States could be considered a utopia. Now, that doesn't mean everybody is living like with, candy canes and blowjobs. Life sucks for a lot of people. But if you zoom out at 30,000 feet, the United States is a utopia. However, that utopia has a lot of power behind it. Now, them kind of instilling a, I want to say fascist sort of control over the biosphere because there is no second Earth. There's not,
Mhm.
right? There's maybe a couple parts of Mars where you can breathe without a mask, but there's no second Earth. And so for me, it makes sense if the solar punk utopia you talk about is kind of like how the Federation is this nice neoliberal utopia, but man, don't fuck with the money in the Federation. Like,
Don't insult the root beer.
don't insult the root beer. And so, and this is me just
Well,
kind of
because again, that
spitballing.
it's like that. I bring up that I bring up the root beer. There's that famous. I want to say famous. There's so many famous little lines. There's that quote in Deep Space Nine where Garrick. I want to say it's Garrick is talking to Quark.
Yep,
Garrick tries root beer for the first time and says, "Oh, it's revolting." And Quark says, "Yeah, just like the Federation, it's so saccharine and sweet on the outside, but then you peel that back, and you realize that it's really nasty on the inside."
exactly. And
And I
with,
think that's actually something, if I may, that's actually something else that I've thought of, especially in more recent weeks and months, as far as like the political structure of the ICA versus the alliance. Because one thing about one thing about modern politics, because there's a sort of, you've got liberal and conservative, but you've also got authoritarian and libertarian. It's possible to have a political ideology that falls into one of four qualities based on those two axes. And the thing is, the ICA would probably fall into the more liberal, or more, maybe not liberal, but liberal and conservative in terms of like economics. They would probably
yeah,
fall into the more authoritarian conservative in terms of economics. And in the case of the ICA, it would be more like, no, we think our free market is great, so you're going to as well.
offhand, preserving the environment and making sure the biosphere is functional, that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a total ecological collapse and then you have a bunch of people that say, we're going to fix this, we're going to fix the environment no matter what, and then like it kind of becomes like their religion, and then all of Earth is dedicated toward this, then I don't think it's going to be kind of happy-go-lucky, like anarchist solar punk utopia like you've described it.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be more of a top-down, if you burn carbon into the atmosphere, we're going to put a bullet in your head sort of place. It's going to be rough, and they will fucking kill you if you put some, like, God help you if you put plastic in on the ground. Like, and
It's kind of like Singapore with like spitting or spitting gum on the sidewalk.
exactly. I don't see Earth being to this kind of like, we're not really involved. They're gonna be not involved. They'll be involved.
A lot of things to offer, but they might not be like directly they're, if anything, they'd probably be aloof. They would probably not care about the troubles
I
of
don't.
the rest of the solar system
I don't.
necessarily, because they have everything they need.
They would be aloof as long as it doesn't fuck with the money.
Yeah.
If it fucks with
So
the money,
basically, here's where we go. And first of all, I want to say thank you for throwing this idea out there because this is something I had considered, and it actually opens up some really cool avenues for stories, especially based on a story that I've sort of sketched out that I haven't written yet, but whatever. Um, but the idea of maybe there being like a big three for both. There's Earth, Mars, and Ceres on the side of the ICA, because Ceres is, if I haven't with or the largest dwarf planet in the asteroid belt. The Confederation of the Main Belt, of which Ceres is the capital, is basically the like financial center of the financial and resource center of the ICA, because the Confederation of the Main Belt basically pumps out so much raw material and processes it, they basically become the mercantile hub of the
Why
ICA.
wouldn't Earth run the ICA?
Well, that's the thing. They would be part. They would be probably on it would be like a triumvirate because it would be Earth. Earth is the like.
But
Maybe
why? I
Earth is.
mean, all of the resources, like no one's going to have more resources than an Earth with a fully restored ecology.
It's
And no
true.
one's going to be more
Yeah.
powerful because resources equals power. And if you have, and again, this is just me spitballing, but if you have a sort of top down, if you litter, we will fucking shoot you sort of mentality. If you have an idyllic paradise, those are typically won by the point of a gun. And I I see Earth in the future as this green, beautiful place where everyone just raises kids and it's awesome. And I don't know, in my head, they're running the ICA, and the ICA is almost how they maintain the status quo for themselves, right? Like we've talked about
Mars is
before,
the dog they let off, and Mars is the dog they let off the leash when they have to.
Mars is the dog they let off the leash. We've talked about it before. America is so we don't even think about how really powerful we are because we are the world's currency. Like we are the world's policemen. We are the world's culture center. We are the world encapsulated. Go,
There's a
but
there's
go.
a there's a bit from. Have you ever? I'm assuming you've heard of it anyway, even if you haven't seen it. But you've heard of Ken Burns' Civil War documentary
Yes.
series. There's a passage from that where I think it was Shelby Foote, who's a very famous um, Civil War historian of Southern extraction, who mentioned like while being interviewed for the beat for the content of this documentary series, said that the war basically was a foregone conclusion. The idea that the civil that the South could have somehow won the war, it's not really even worth entertaining, because he says that, like, what was the thing that always stuck with me, the thing that always jumps out at me when I think of this passage, this particular quote, is he says that, like, at the height of the American Civil War, the Harvard rowing team still held its annual competition. The war is going on full tilt, and the North is kind of still like, well, business as usual. Whereas the South is like, fuck everybody, all hands on deck, because they
Yeah.
didn't have enough people and they didn't have resources.
Yeah. But the
It's kind
North
of how
did.
the whole United States is nowadays.
Yeah.
Is just business as usual.
Business as usual. We were at war for 2 decades, and you didn't really notice unless your family was in the military, Nick.
Or you had to go through an airport.
Yeah. Okay. So in closing, um, any closing thoughts about the frontier wars? We'll do more episodes about this, but
There's plenty more to cover, believe me, because we just cover like the the first movement, basically, not even the first movement, the preamble. So yeah,
okay.
that's all.
O-
That's what I'll say, basically.
On that note, for the Blanket Fortress of Solitude, I am Derwin,
And I am Nick.
and we will see you next Monday morning at 0700.